Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Danae Buckingham. I'm a filmmaker and a student of archaeology and anthropology, and I will be your host for this evening's panel of extraordinary women in archaeology, who throughout their careers have been exploring and unearthing the past far afield in such legendary sites as Rapa Nui, also of course known as Easter Island, to Egypt, the snow-capped mountains of South America to the Anatolian coast. In fact, I'm humbled to have been asked to host tonight's panel. I truly feel in the presence of greatness. And with every talk that I have with these women, and as we've gotten to know each other over these past months, as we've been putting together this event, I become ever more inspired. So I'm sure by the end of tonight, you will be too. But before we get started, I would like to take a moment to offer some gratitude. This evening is brought to you by the Explorers Club and Discovery. I have been a member of the Explorers Club since 2017, but the club's history stretches all the way back to 1904, and its membership spans the entire globe. Through this club, I've not only found incredible adventures, but also some of my dearest friends. So thank you to the Explorers Club and all of the people who run the machine behind the scenes, especially to Kevin Murphy for all of your help with coordinating tonight's technical details. Speaking of people who keep the club running, Milbury Polk, you have been our fearless leader and spearheading the celebrations that mark this, the 40th anniversary of women being inducted as members into the Explorers Club. Milbury has been the magic behind this ongoing lecture series and of course the Pathfinder Symposium, featuring almost 60 extraordinary women in all different disciplines of exploration. This is coming up on November 5th and 6th, so don't forget to mark your calendars. I am also very pleased to say that I will be hosting another panel during the Pathfinder Symposium that will feature women in various disciplines of anthropology, including archaeology. Discovery is a new partner here at the club, but is already accomplishing great things. So thank you also very much to Discovery. I would also like to express gratitude for women around the world who probably don't get thanked enough, but for women who have or are even considering dedicating their lives to the quest for expanding our horizons and the unending pursuit of scientific knowledge. It's through the passion and dedication of each of us that we continue to push the boundaries of our known world and inspire a global community of women who show that the furthest we thought we could go is actually only just the beginning. So tonight's schedule will go like this. First, I will tell you a little bit about myself, but then we'll jump straight into the 4 presentations by our featured speakers tonight. Each of them will speak to you for about 15 minutes about themselves and their work in archaeology. As they're speaking, I am sure you'll have plenty of questions, so please note them down or send them via the chat box here. And once our speakers are finished, we're going to open it up for some question and answer time. And then we'll wrap everything up. So now, if it's late for any of you, and I do sympathize, it is in fact 2:04 in the morning for me here in Greece, or if you do miss any parts of this event or you need to leave before it's finished, no worries, the recording will be uploaded to the Explorers Club's YouTube channel in the coming days, and you'll be able to rewatch the whole thing there. So I'm going to share my screen with you and tell you a little bit about myself. One moment. All right, so as I mentioned, my name is Danae. You might notice that I have a little bit of a muddled accent, which I tend to call a mutt. I am a cross-culture kid. My mother is Canadian American and my father is Australian. I grew up between America and Australia. Since then, I have lived in many parts of this beautiful planet and had the opportunity to work and experience different cultures, such as Greek, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and I even spent the last 5 months in Panama, and have recently released a short film in conjunction with the Darklands Foundation about an ingenious food sovereignty program that arose in the Nabe Bugle communities near Bocas del Toro in the wake of the pandemic. I am a filmmaker and I specialize in topics concerning humanity, culture, language, and how all of this ties together with our connection to the environment. I'm currently studying anthropology and archaeology at the University of Southern Queensland, and I am a part of the Explorers Club's Next Generation Explorers Network, which spearheads the connections between and the work of the younger membership of the club. I've taken part in 4 flag expeditions so far, including marine conservation and coral acoustics in Curaçao, cave exploration with the legendary Bill Steele at Pash in Huautla de Jimenez in Mexico. And then twice I've carried the flag here to Greece for underwater archaeological expeditions to the archipelago of Forni-Courseillon, led by Dr. George Koutsouplakis and Dr. Peter Campbell. In Forni, the work of the Courseille Institute for Historical and Archaeological Research and the incredible team of which I am an honored member have so far identified 58 ancient shipwrecks dating from 600 BC all the way up until the 17th century, with their origins all across the Mediterranean and the Aegean. I'm very pleased to say that we will be returning for another field season this September, so do watch this space. This year, I was also invited to be the field photographer and videographer for the Bays of East Attica Regional Survey here in Greece, in the Greek seaside town of Porto Rafti, directed by the University of Toronto's own formidable force, Dr. Sarah Murray. This project is also ongoing, and the site is exceptionally rich, yielding artifacts that have a lot to teach us from a great span of time. They span prehistoric and historic time periods, including the early Bronze Age, the final phase of the late Bronze Age, the classical and Hellenistic periods, as well as the late Roman period. I am currently in the process of finishing a short film about this year's expedition, and then over the coming years, we'll be working on also a longer piece about bears. In 2018, I co-founded the Discover Humanity project, and since then have filmed life and culture in 18 different countries around the world, asking people from all different backgrounds and walks of life the question, what message would you like to send to the rest of the world? The idea being to show the beauty in our differences and the unity in our similarities. Some of these films are already available on YouTube if you type in Discover Humanity, and then others are still in production. Soon to be released will be a film that I shot in conjunction with the Lao Elephant Initiative and Mandalao Elephant Conservation in Laos about the changing future of elephant tourism in Southeast Asia, where many people and groups are actively working to shift the paradigm to one of ethical care and consciousness. This film will be called Walking Each Other Home and will be released online in the coming months. I'm also in the pre-production stages of a film about an endangered colony of seahorses in northern Greece and the AI who is working to protect them, and how this technology can be revolutionary for the ways in which we monitor and safeguard marine protected areas and underwater environments all across our blue planet. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm fascinated by the human experience, about what life is, about the languages we speak and the ways we communicate, and how we can better understand one another in order to consciously steward our relationship with our environment and each other. So to combine 2 of my favorite quotes by Carl Sagan and Albert Einstein, you have to know the past to understand the present. But also, if you want to know the future, look to the past. So let's look to the past and dive in for our speakers here tonight. For some of you, you're coming from all over the world, and for others, a bit closer to home. Our first speaker, in fact, is very close to home, as she is currently in New York, which is also the home of the Explorers Club's headquarters. I am extremely pleased to introduce our first speaker tonight. Her name is Dr. Salima Ikram. Dr. Ikram is the first Pakistani Egyptologist, a distinguished professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo, and is a research fellow at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. If that wasn't enough, she also has an immense list of career credits and publications, but I will let her speak more about all of those. Her current research focuses on funerary and religious customs, especially mummification, the changing climate of Egypt, rock art, and ancient Egyptian foodways. So please take it away, Dr. Ikram.
Thank you so much, Danea. It is a great honor for me to be invited to this panel, to be with great company, and to talk about archaeology and something that is a bit unusual, which is a Pakistani woman's life in archaeology, particularly Egyptology, because so far I'm the only one, but I'm still hoping that I'll get a few other young women interested. It's not sort of the career that every parent's dream. But I have been very, very fortunate that I have managed to pursue this great love of my life. I have worked in Greece, in Turkey, Sudan, and of course throughout Egypt from Alexandria to Aswan. And I have been very privileged to do this. And the many people I have met along the way and with whom I have worked and collaborated are extraordinary and have led me sometimes astray, but sometimes along the right way. Now, when I started my great interest, when I was all of 8.5, my primary interest was daily life. I really wanted to know how the ancient Egyptians lived. What did they eat? What did they drink? You know, bathrooms and kitchens are always of great importance to people, as well as how they made things, technology. And so when I did my PhD, I worked on meat production in ancient Egypt, and my dissertation was entitled Choice Cuts. And of course, I am not a vegetarian, which is thankful given my research topic. Now, while I was doing that, of course, now when I was introduced, one of the things that was said that I'm doing funerary archaeology, which is in fact something that I did not start out being terribly interested in. But mummies really are preserved meat. And so working from the preservation of meat, I wound up straying into the land of mummification. And of course, one can't say, but mummies really are fascinating. To start off, I like to define that a mummy is an artificially preserved body of a human or an animal. And we have mummification that starts the dawn of Egyptian civilization, pharaonic civilization, really, so about 3000 BC, and continues well into the Christian period, so into 600, almost 700 AD. So really, this is a tradition that lasts for several thousand years and obviously changes over time. And when you look at a mummy, you learn a great deal more than just about the technology of mummification. We learn about the biography of the individual, whether it is a human or an animal. So it really gives one an intimate relationship with the people of the past. So we can learn the individual stories, we can learn about religious beliefs, we can learn about trade, exchange, technology, and in some cases, with enough bodies, epidemiology. So it is quite interesting because you can see how mummification evolved over time. And it is one of my questions is to find out why it changed and whether change is is it a diachronic event or is it something that is more localized? Are they geographical variations in mummification? Obviously, there are going to be socioeconomic ramifications as well. So here we actually have, this is a Coptic mummy of the 5th or 6th century AD, and they're not mummified well at all. They're just salt is packed over their bodies. And sometimes in this case, there's a lot of grass put on, and then they're wrapped up in lots of this linen. And you can always recognize a Coptic body by this red and white tape. That's sort of a dead giveaway. This, of course, going back in time, is the mummy of Neb. He died when he was in his 40s. He was buried in about 1650 BC in Thebes. He's lying on his side, and he's very poorly mummified as well. And it was a bit of a conundrum, because is it the time period or is it his social class? Because he seems to be of a good class. He's got a very beautiful coffin with feathers painted on it, his face in detail, some grave goods as well. So it is an interesting thing to try and piece together these differences by looking at the mummy as well as their grave goods. I've also been able to track through time, particularly at this one site, which is a Theban tomb 11. We've got we've got things from 2000 BC all the way into about 300 AD. So at this one site, Theban tomb 11, directed by Jose Galan, where I work on their mummies, it's been a really fascinating voyage of discovery, trying to piece together why this place was regarded as so important as to have burials from so many periods, but also to see how the burials changed over time. Because generally we think of people being buried in tombs, but some of them, like the White Lady, because her coffin in fact is pure white, painted, she dates to about 970 BC, but she was buried just in this courtyard amongst all of this rubble that you see here, and next to one other individual. So it is a curious thing. So we're trying to piece together these different parts of the evidence to try and figure out why suddenly in these courtyards of older tombs we have lots of these burials. And her mummy is actually very nicely made. She was very well preserved. It looks a little bit manky here right now, but she was, when we examined her after we dusted her off, beautifully preserved, every bone intact. You have the flesh as well, hands nicely positioned over her hips, and lots of linen being used. But yet she was not placed inside a tomb, she was placed outside. So we're still trying to work that one out. Now, one of the questions, of course, one also has is, as I said, how are mummies made? And it does change over 3,000 years, and it does depend on your atelier and your wealth. But I was very fortunate to work in the Valley of the Kings, where we had a major breakthrough, because I was working there, and in 2006, under the direction of Otto Scharden, we found the first tomb that had been found in the valley since that of Tutankhamun. So we found KV63, which was terribly exciting. And then when we started digging it out, here we go, KV63, first tomb since Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, looking pretty intact. Except when we started to remove the material, we found out that not a single one of these coffins contained a body. Instead, the whole thing is an embalming deposit. It contains the material used for a mummification of someone who's buried in the Valley of the Kings. So this is our director, who has sadly passed away, Dr. Otto Scharden. But this was incredible, because this was the first instance where I, who work on mummies a lot, have had a chance to work on all the bits and bobs that have been buried, the detritus that was buried from making royal mummies. And what was interesting is it's not just the mummification materials as well, but a lot of the attendant rituals. So here we have a lot of these little clay trays, which we were trying to figure out what they were being used for, and they seem to have had a very temporary life. They were made very quickly. They were used in the funeral because they put various offerings on them, sometimes wheat, sometimes barley, sometimes other things, and then they would just squish them and throw them away. But because it was sacred, everything had to be buried in these jars. So it was like Christmas multiple times over, opening up these jars and seeing what was inside. And it's not very easy, I have to tell you, to try and stratigraphically excavate a jar when your head's in there, and there's not much light. But they were filled with wonderful things. So we had a lot of pots. We have this great thing, which is actually, you figured out, you use it to swab the hard to reach places in your body. And you put some resins and oils in them and you poke about. And then these I call nose noodles. And you twing them up and you stick them up your nose to dry it out nicely. And before you do that, that's right towards the end, you have these cute little balls of natron, which is a salt that is used for desiccation and defatting purposes. So it was wonderful, and we're still trying to piece together how this can be worked in reverse to explain how mummification and attendant rituals were carried out. Now, what is useful is this feeds into experimental archaeology, because that is a way of trying to test any hypothesis. And so this is a sheep which would have been eaten. Don't feel sorry for it, it lives forever. And so as a result, experimental work could be carried out using tools that were based on absolutely identical ones that the ancient Egyptians used. And so my students and I have gone through a series of mummification experiments in an effort to understand how mummies are made and how all of these embalming deposits, what we find there, how that actually feeds into what we know about mummification. And as well as, of course, doing the experimental work, we have millions of mummies to work with. Now, most people are really familiar with human mummies, but they are less familiar with the phenomenon of animal mummification, which was actually big business in ancient Egypt, particularly from about 600 BC to about 300, almost 400 AD. And you can just see that over here you have a vast swathe of different kinds of creatures that have been mummified. And this is quite a fascinating thing, because in addition to learning about mummification, this opens up a whole nother view and way of looking at ancient Egypt, and not just about the culture, but also the physical landscape, because I'm quite interested in climate change and also in species variation. And so these animal mummies are really an incredible insight into studying these topics. We have catacombs throughout Egypt, and you can see there are millions of these pots. Each pot has a mummy in it. These ones contain falcons, others contain ibises. But you have to think of them, we have at least 1.6 ibis mummies that we can figure out that we have in Saqqara, in one site. So it is a phenomenal. Theban Tomb 11, where I showed you the human mummies, the Progetto di Jehuti, directed by Jose Galan, we have bundles of mummies, which are extraordinary, because that's a whole separate story. But you can see that instead of this beautiful formalized burial, these ones are jumbled up and packed in and thrown in. Even remote sites in Egypt contain animal mummies. This is Kharga Oasis, a place where I have been working for some time on an archaeological survey, where we have been identifying new, well, hitherto unknown sites. And a lot of what you're seeing here of the Roman period, we've got Roman forts here in the middle of the desert, which are quite extraordinary. But in addition to the forts, we wound up with finding burial places for canine mummies. And so these are sacred to the god Anubis, who is patron of travelers and voyagers. And also this persisted into the Roman period, because a lot of the Roman soldiers who came here were told to go off into the desert. And they, of course, had their own religion, but they were going off into scary places. And so a lot of them adopted some of the Egyptian belief systems and took upon themselves to give mummified dogs as offerings to Anubis. So Anubis, god of the desert and of travel, like St. Christopher, would keep you safe. And so we have these depots of these Anubis shrines for people who travel in the desert, including Roman soldiers, some who came from the Black Sea region of Turkey, which is extraordinary. As part of my whole interest in animal mummies, it was spurred by the animal mummy room at the Cairo Museum, which I have reinstalled. And now I hope people who come to Egypt have a chance to visit it. Through my work, I actually, standing on the shoulders of others, I have managed to establish the different kinds of mummy types, and make a typology about pets, food, sacred animals, votive offerings. And when archaeologists don't know what the hell's going on, we will say, oh, that's other or ritual. So we have that group as well. And also I established a protocol for how to study these things using macroscopic analysis, i.e. visual, radiography, which includes CT scans, doing FTIR, looking at GCMS, carbon-14, DNA, isotopes, all of these different things. And because through studying animal mummies, one can learn a great deal about climate, environment, different kinds of species and evolution by looking at the DNA, veterinary practices, religious and cultural beliefs, technology, and trade, as well as economy. And all kinds of creatures got mummified, whether they were cats, dogs, ibises, or even scarab beetles. We have been studying ibis mummies in order to try and establish whether they were bred or whether they were captured wild by using their DNA. And this is one of these lovely mummies from the Iziko Museum in Cape Town. And it was beautifully in Stellenbosch University. We had it CT scanned, and we found, quite curiously, that this poor creature might have choked to death because it was overfed. They generally regurgitate, as it were, but this mouth tail was all the way up its neck. So it's led to questions about how these animals were acquired, whether they were bred just to be killed for mummification. So it was quite a fun and interesting thing. Another recent discovery on animal mummies has been, we found a lion some years ago in Saqqara in the Bubastion, but the mummification was not good. And then very recently, this has been found, and I actually recognized it because partially before the X-ray, it was bothering me that it had this funny thing on its forehead, because generally when you have cat mummies, they have a scarab there. This is definitely not a scarab. And I was looking at it, and then I suddenly thought, oh my God, it looks much more like the mess you see on lion cubs. And then indeed the X-ray proved that that was the case. So animal mummies, whether large or small, tell you huge amounts of information. And recently we've been working with shrew mummies, both from the delta of Egypt at Quesna, as well as in the south with Theban Tomb 11. And there we have identified species that are no longer found in Egypt at all and indicate a very different climate. And so using this information, we are working with geologists in going back in time and trying to recreate the different phases of climate change in Egypt, and to see how that colors our understanding of the history of ancient Egypt, and also see how the new dams are going to impact us in the future. So mummies, whether they are large or small, human or animal, really tell us a huge amount about the past and can inform us about the present and also the future. Thank you very much.
Extraordinary, Salima. What a life and work. I am sure we'll have plenty of questions at the end. We actually already have had them flowing in, so I've been noting them down. And as a reminder to everyone watching, who actually I've heard come from as far away as Australia, Panama. We have people tuning in from Oregon, Texas, and of course, home in New York City. So for everyone watching, if you do want to ask anything to any of our speakers or in general, please do type it into the chat box here and it will come through to me. And then after each of the presentations, we'll go through as many of these questions as we can to be answered. So I have had the pleasure of meeting our next speaker in person. Oh my gosh, in these days, meeting people in person is quite a feat. But obviously it was before the pandemic. I actually met this next speaker at the Explorers Club annual dinner a few years ago. And it's been delightful to get to know her better as we've been organizing this event. She is truly an incredible person and a very inspiring archaeologist. So up next is Dr. Sarah Yarmonds. She specializes in the imperial period of the Roman Empire, and her particular emphasis is on ancient science and religion. Sarah received her PhD in art history from the University of Southern California, and her work focuses on biblical sites in the Near East and Turkey. She is a 2021 and 22 Fulbright Fellow and currently working on archaeological research on Greco-Roman sites in Turkey. Her resume includes television credits and so much more, but I will let her talk with you and tell you more about herself and her research. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Danae, for that wonderful introduction. And it's really just an honor and a wonderful feeling to be here tonight, even virtually. With my colleagues, everyone is doing such exciting work. And so I appreciate the opportunity to share mine. And for the last several years, one of my primary research areas has been Roman medicine and Roman medical technology, as well as the impact of pandemic events on the Roman Empire. That second area of my research started years ago, so it's been a very surreal 18 months in our present time. But I got into this particular research area because when I was living in Rome, I took an archaeological speleology course, which is basically urban spelunking. And they trained us to go underground into the subterranean areas of the city of Rome and do archaeological surveys in that environment. Rome is like an urban lasagna, so you have layer on layer. Many cities in that part of the world are. And so the lower you go, the farther back you go in time. So I spent a lot of time in the catacombs. And as you're walking through here, through these spaces, documenting the inscriptions, it really struck me that even though the language was so different and the culture, of course, their technologies, so many things were different about the Roman Empire than our present culture today. And yet so many other things were very much the same. And I became very interested in what we have in common with people in antiquity. And certainly the concern with disease and injury is one of those. That is, combating disease and injury is part of the human condition, no matter what time period or culture you are in. And so that's really what sparked my interest in this topic. And I did a deep dive into it for my doctoral dissertation. And so in the interest of brevity tonight, I'm going to just highlight one site that has been a pretty significant part of my research for the last several years. And it's a site called the Domus del Chirurgo, which means House of the Surgeon in Italian. It's located in Rimini, Italy. And in the process of introducing you to this site, we're going to get to know a rather remarkable Greco-Roman physician who owned the house, in which two of the ground floor rooms served as the site of his very successful medical practice. But really briefly, just a bit of historical background in this particular area. The site dates to the mid-3rd century when Rimini was sacked by invading Germanic tribes. This was part of a broader period of instability, which is sometimes referred to as the 3rd century crisis in Rome, when the empire's frontiers were regularly destabilized by enemies from without. In this case of the northern frontiers, it was the Germanic tribes. Rimini was close to this frontier region, and during the 3rd century, it suffered a number of attacks. However, it was at some point between 258 and 260 that the entire northern quarter of the city was destroyed by fire as a result of invasion, and it wasn't rebuilt until the 5th century. Now, ironically, the method of the house's destruction is what accounts for its preservation almost 1800 years later. Fire destroyed the upper story of the building, which collapsed, and it preserved the mosaics and many of the artifacts on the lower story. The area was almost completely abandoned until the early 5th century, when the Emperor Honorius moved the capital to Ravenna in 410. And he did that because the Visigoths had taken up residence in Rome. It was a terrible sacking of Rome in 410. So in terms of the site's preservation, the method of its destruction was actually a good thing, because by the time rebuilding began 150 years later, the previous structures had been forgotten and the later structures were built on top of the rubble. Now, the modern discovery of the site occurred initially in 1989. And like so many discoveries of its type, it was the result of a happy accident. Construction work in one of Rimini's main piazzas, Piazza Ferrari, was undertaken to repair the damage caused by a fallen tree. And during the course of this, as they're removing this giant tree, construction workers saw fresco fragments and pieces of ceramic and brick in the roots of this very old tree. Now, eventually, the remains of the Domus del Chirurgo were uncovered and some of the rooms were identified. Now, the two rooms that we're zeroing in on tonight are the patient's cubiculum. Cubiculum in Latin is bedroom, and the medica taberna. Taberna is shop. So there would be food taberne, there would be, a blacksmith's taberne, and in this case, it's a medica taberne, a medical clinic. It was in these two rooms, the Medica Taberna in particular, where the truly extraordinary find was made. What really sets this site apart. It was a cache of over 150 surgical instruments. This is the largest single collection of medical instruments discovered from any period in the territories of the Roman Empire. It's almost double the number of those that were recovered from Pompeii and Herculaneum combined. Several instruments were identified that have been known to us from ancient literature, but physical examples had never been found. So this was a really exciting discovery. And over the course of the next 20 years, more and more of the site was revealed. And it's taken us up until the last few years to really thoroughly study all 150 of these surgical instruments. Now, in a collection of 150 plus surgical instruments, you would expect some duplicates, but this is actually not the case. Almost every piece was unique. So this is a very carefully and deliberately assembled collection. The physician who owned these knew what he was doing, and he was very intentional about the instruments that he acquired. One of the reasons I chose this particular site to talk to you about is because the museum in Rimini did such a great job of recreating these two rooms. So this is a recreation of the Medica Taberna and the patient's cubiculum beyond it that you can see in this very lovely museum. Now, the museum's recreation of the Medica Taberna is this image right here. And it is in this room that the majority of the surgical instruments were found. And aside from their value as archaeological artifacts, these types of instruments also tell us a great deal about not only this particular physician's expertise, but the types of surgical procedures that were able to be performed during the imperial period of the Roman Empire. The imperial period, for those of you who don't know, it's approximately the first 5 centuries of the Common Era. So what was here? In the left corner, you can see various sized mortars and pestles that were used to make and mix medicines. A number of scales were also used for the same reason, and they were recovered from this room. Over 30 intact scalpels with bronze handles and iron blades, 10 bladeless scalpel handles, and 17 detached iron blades. So that is almost 50 different scalpels that you have represented there, and there's virtually no duplicates. 9 instruments that were used for trepanation procedures. Trepanation is a very dangerous procedure used to basically drilling a hole in the skull to relieve intracranial pressure, usually from a head injury. 12 bone chisels, 19 spring forceps. These were used to remove foreign objects from wounds, but they could also be used as arterial clamps to prevent the patient from bleeding out. One really fascinating instrument was a Diocles Spoon, the first of its kind ever found. It is essentially an object that was invented by Greco-Roman doctors to remove barbed arrowheads from wounds, because the barbed arrows would often do just as much, if not more damage coming out as they did going in. 3 small blades that were used in eye surgeries in this time, and a number of instruments that we know were used in surgeries to repair hernias, remove bladder and kidney stones, and perform tonsillectomies. So it's clear from this collection that our surgeon specialized primarily in bone surgery and the mitigation of traumatic wounds. He almost certainly served as a physician in the Roman army, which at this time was the best way for a doctor to gain anatomical knowledge because human dissections were illegal in this period. So several weapons of types that were commonly used by Roman soldiers in the 3rd century were also found in this house. And so that and a few other objects really helped support the theory that this physician had military affiliations. He likely served in the army before going on to establish a civilian practice. So who was this doctor? Well, we know his name. It's Eutyches. And we know this because one of his patients told us. This is the patient's cubiculum, the patient's bedroom, where surgeries would take place and where the patient would hopefully recover. And a graffito was found. This is basically someone inscribed some graffiti in the wall of the cubiculum, presumably one of his patients. And he refers to Eutyches. And the first line of that Latin inscription was Eutyches, who is a good man, lives here. So this graffito has been traced to the type of writing used in the 3rd century, the same period in which the house was occupied by the doctor, middle of the 3rd century. Eutyches is a Greek name. The labels carved into some of the recovered medicine bottles were also written in Greek. And this is consistent with what we know of the medical tradition in Rome. Most practicing physicians were either Greek or trained in Greece. And this certainly seems to be the case with Eutyches. So here are some of the actual instruments discovered at the site. You can see they melted together in bundles due to the heat of the fire. This is actually helpful in identifying certain instruments because if we're not quite sure what it is, or if there's a question between a couple possibilities, knowing the instruments it was identified with is very helpful. On the lower left is the largest cluster of bone surgery instruments from the Domus del Chirurgo. You've got these straight-jawed sequestrum forceps here at the bottom. This was used to remove foreign objects or pieces of bone from wounds. And this is a folding handle of a trepan bow. This was used to turn the drill during trepanation procedures. So this here on the upper left is all of these objects were also recovered from the Domus del Chirurgo. This represents the basic physician's instrument collection. So most physicians in the Roman world, if they didn't have any other instruments, they would at least have these. So you can note the double scalpel on the far left. You've got a different type of scalpel blade on either end. Here on the lower right is a bone axe that was used for amputations. And here's just an example of what a trepanation bow looks like, and 2 examples of the drills here in this image on the upper left. I've chosen these from a different museum because they're in better condition. It gives you a better idea of what they actually looked like. And there on the lower right, you get the sort of chilling image of how they were used. And finally, one of the other sets of objects recovered from the Domus del Chirurgo were a number of medicine jars made of glass and ceramic. These are 2 of the ceramic ones. And these 2 were inscribed, so we know what they contained. We were also able to conduct some residue analysis on these. And the one on the left contained something called chemedrium in Latin, and on the right, a substance called abrotinum. Chemedrium was recommended by the 1st century CE physician Dioscorides as an antivenom to alleviate chest congestion and also to stimulate healing in torpid ulcers and abscesses. Abrotonum is mentioned by both Dioscorides and the 1st century encyclopedist Pliny the Elder as somewhat of an all-purpose medication for a wide variety of conditions, such as inflammation, coughs, parasitic infections, and also as an antivenom for certain types of snake or spider bites. Now, modern science has demonstrated that chamaedrium, and both of these substances are derived from certain types of plants that grow in the Mediterranean area. Modern science has demonstrated that chamaedrium has antibacterial properties, and today it's used as a component in medications that are used to treat septic sores and ulcers, as well as skin infections. Abrotronum has properties that would have been useful to help stimulate the healing of lesions and abscesses, and it's used today in the treatment of some conditions associated with tuberculosis and rheumatism. So the ancient Romans did have medicinal substances in their arsenal that they could use to address infection. Not as effective as our modern medicine, of course, but they were not without some efficacious medicines. So that is sort of the very quick overview of the Domus d'Archeologo in Rimini. There are 3 other sites that I've been working on the last few years. Next year, or well, actually this coming academic year, I leave in September. I have a Fulbright fellowship to Turkey, and I will be spending this next academic year working with researchers of Akdeniz University on this site, Rhodiopolis, which is in Antalya. This is a 2nd century medical complex that included a library, a temple dedicated to Asclepius and Hygieia, who were the Greco-Roman deities of medicine and health. The entire complex was donated to the city by one of its wealthiest citizens, a physician named Heraclitus. He was, not coincidentally, the author of many of the books in the library. Now, I believe this complex may have served also as a medical training center of sorts. We know that these types of centers existed. The most famous one was at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. We don't thus far have no physical examples of what these places looked like. I think there's a good possibility that this complex in Rhodiopolis is in fact a center of medical training, in addition to a library where physicians would come to learn and patients would come to receive treatment. And so it's well worth investigating. And some of my colleagues, my Turkish colleagues at Akdeniz University, and I will be digging into this, excuse the pun, in the coming year. So watch this space. We'll see what comes out of this in the next 9 months. But thank you so much for your time and attention. And I'm happy to take questions at the end.
So puns always allowed, by the way. Always, and in fact, encouraged.
It was a really easy one, that one.
Well, yeah, okay, but hey, nevertheless, we can step it up later. Sarah, you're amazing. What an incredible presentation. I'm still cherishing the idea of a Roman lasagna of archaeological layers. I think I'm going to think of that in the field like every single time. That being said, I also really don't think bone surgery in the imperial period sounds pleasant at all. And like, note to self, try to never ever have to visit a doctor in ancient Rome, even if the doctor was a good man. It sounds horrible, but an absolutely incredible sight and finds. And I definitely look forward to another glass of bubbly someday, hopefully at HQ, and a catch up once we can all start to move about the world again. So our next speaker has actually not able to participate actively with us tonight because she is in fact so far afield that she can't even call in. However, she has sent us an amazing presentation, which we have her slides and also an audio that she's recorded. So the only thing is that she will be missing from our Q&A tonight. So Dr. Constanza Cerruti is the first female high-altitude archaeologist, amazing, and you may know best for her work as the co-discoverer of the best preserved Incan frozen mummies. I think we also have a mummy theme going on tonight. Thankfully, from your questions, I see a lot of you also really like mummies. Constanza is the author of 25 books and has had more than 100 ascents and surveys on remote Andean peaks above 17,000 feet, as well as she's a co-director of excavations at the highest archaeological site in the world. She's currently a professor at the Catholic University of Salta and a scholar of the National Council for Scientific Research in Argentina. So Kevin, our wizard behind the curtain tonight, would you please roll with Constanza's presentation when you're ready?
I am Dr. Constanza Ceruti, an anthropologist and archaeologist from Argentina. I was born in the port of Buenos Aires, but the love of mountains runs in my veins. I am a descendant of people who migrated to South America from the mountains of Europe, and I have native Andean ancestry. In my view, high-altitude archaeology and the anthropological study of sacred mountains are unique ways to learn about our planet, preserve its genuine cultural diversity, and celebrate the human spirit of exploration. For nearly a quarter of a century, my work has contributed to consolidate high-altitude archaeology and the anthropology of sacred mountains as scientific disciplines. It has also inspired the immersion of glacial archaeology. The Incas were the first civilization in human history to climb to elevations above 20,000 feet. The Inca mountain top shrines crowned the summits of the highest mountains in the Andes, consecrating them as places for offerings and sacrifices. I ascended to the summits of more than 100 mountains above 5,000 meters in the Andes, including Mount Pisces, the second highest volcano in the world, and Mount Aconcagua, the highest peak in the Western Hemisphere. I also climbed peaks in Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, northern Chile, northwestern Argentina, and Patagonia. In 1997, I wrote the first book on theory and methods for high-altitude archaeology. 2 years later, the academic press of the University of Buenos Aires published my book on the sacred summits of northwestern Argentina. Numerous scientific papers were also published in which attributes such as the altitude of the mountain, the visibility, as well as the accessibility of the summit were taken into consideration in my analysis with the purpose of understanding the strategies used by the Incas to cope with the glacier climbs, active volcanoes, snow-capped peaks, etc. National Geographic explorer Johann Reinhardt, who had also climbed mountains in the Andes, invited me to join a group of Peruvian archaeologists during a one-month excavation at 5,800 meters inside the crater of Mount Misti, an active volcano in southern Peru. Subsequently, we conducted an archaeological mission to rescue the remains of a mummy that had been destroyed by treasure hunters on the summit of Mount Kewar, a dormant volcano above 20,000 feet in northwestern Argentina. In 1999, Reinhardt and I co-directed the project to the highest archaeological site in the world, and we discovered 3 extraordinarily preserved ice mummies on the summit of Mount Yuyayaco at nearly 22,200 feet. Together with a group of collaborators, we spent a month on the mountain facing snowstorms and extreme weather conditions. We excavated for 2 weeks within the death zone, nearly 7 kilometers above sea level. We discovered and brought to safety the frozen bodies of 3 Inca children, the best preserved mummies in history. In addition to protecting the frozen mummies, which are endangered by treasure hunters, climate change, and the impact of mining, we also excavated and brought to safety numerous offerings, including pottery items and miniature figurines, which turned out to be one of the best preserved and best documented collections of artifacts from the Inca civilization. The understanding of the social use and symbolic meaning of these findings was deepened by my analysis of dozens of historical sources, which included chronicles written by the Spanish conquistadors and even manuscripts in Quechua. This research led me to write Yuyayaco, the first academic book on Inca sacrifices and offerings based on evidences collected during scientific archaeological excavations in high altitude. I also co-authored with Reinhardt a book on Inca rituals and sacred mountains published by UCLA. For 6 years, I coordinated the scientific interdisciplinary research of those findings at the Catholic University of Salta, which included DNA studies, hair analysis of the mummies, radiological exams, as well as technical studies on the associated offerings. Some of the leading experts in Europe and America in the field of mummy studies came to Argentina to collaborate with us, and the results of our research were published in numerous and very prestigious academic journals. The Museum of Mountain Archaeology, where the Yuyayaco mummies and offerings are currently preserved, is the second most visited cultural institution in Argentina, while the city of Salta, in the northern part of my country, has grown to become a destination for international cultural tourism. The magnitude of our discovery prompted the inscription of Volcano Yuyayaco and other archaeological sites associated to the Inca road system in the UNESCO World Heritage List. Glacial archaeology can be seen as an evolution of high-altitude archaeology adapted to mountain geographies in Scandinavia, the Rockies, and the Alps. Alpine and Norwegian colleagues started surveying peaks and glaciers in the 21st century, more than 10 years and oftentimes 20 years after the finding of the mummy of the Iceman from Tyrol. Whereas I had already been pioneering groundbreaking archaeological research in the high Andes during the 20th century as the only woman doing this work in the whole world at the time. Environmental challenges are similar in nature but considerably more difficult to overcome in the Andes, a part of our planet where mountains are much higher than most ranges in the world, except the Himalayas. Glaciers are equally dangerous but more inaccessible. Peaks are located hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest settlements. Average temperatures are considerably colder. I worked without access to proper technical equipment, without the assistance of helicopters or the chance of emergency calls. Many times I ended up doing my climbs solo, under-equipped, and with hardly, if any, institutional support. Nowadays, it is substantially easier to practice mountain and glacial archaeology than it was before. In the mid-90s, I could not count on the positive image that glacial archaeology has acquired in the public eye, thanks to the current concerns and awareness about environmental issues. I also had to challenge the skepticism of armchair archaeologists who evaluated my proposals negatively, alleging low feasibility for any project involving a woman working on high mountains. Therefore, it is doubly concerning that the history of our discipline is seemingly being told without its foundational South American chapter. To put things in perspective, by the time Reinhard and I discovered and brought to safety the mummies from Mount Yuyayaco in 1999, I had already surveyed more than 50 mountains above 5,000 meters. This is 17,000 feet in the Andes. Those early contributions that predate most systematic archaeological fieldwork on mountains of Europe, Africa, Asia, and North America should earn Andean high-altitude archaeology its rightful place in the world history of mountain and glacial archaeology. Additionally, as a cultural anthropologist, I have climbed hundreds of mountains in different parts of our planet to study their role in pilgrimage, folklore, popular devotion, mythology, identity, and tourism. When I started working a quarter of a century ago, there was only one book devoted to sacred mountains of the world, published by the Sierra Club in California. My academic production now includes 20 books on sacred mountains of diverse corners of our planet, including Ireland, Scotland, Norway, Thailand, Australia, southern Italy, the Basque Country, Galicia, Costa Rica, Easter Island, Canary Islands, and the Andes. I have also published numerous papers on the sacred dimension of mountains in northern Italy, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Tatras, Crete, Polynesia, and the Americas. My work in this field has been possible thanks to numerous international academic invitations received to lecture at universities, participate in congresses, etc. Frugality, endurance, and hitchhiking abilities acquired at youth also played a part in making logistics possible with the exiguous resources available. Public interest in sacred mountains and high-altitude archaeology has been fueled during my 25 years of intense teaching and international lecturing with academic visits to dozens of universities in Europe, Latin America, Australia, and the United States. Also with the media coverage and worldwide attention sparked by my work and its results. Last but not least, the numerous awards received along my career have also contributed to raise public awareness on the cultural heritage of mountains and the urgency of research at high elevations. I am the youngest member of the National Academy of Sciences in Argentina, and my work has been acknowledged with awards and distinctions, which include the Gold Medal of the International Society of Women Geographers, an honorary doctorate in humanities from the Moravian College in Pennsylvania, the Courage Award from the Wings World Quest, an association that promotes women in science and exploration, the Gold Medal Award of the University of Buenos Aires. I am among the first emerging explorers of the National Geographic Society. I was one of the 5 awardees when the Prince of Asturias in Communication and Humanities was given to the institution. I was also a distinguished lecturer in anthropology at the University of West Georgia, an invited speaker at the first TED Global meeting in Oxford, and a rising talent at the Women Forum for the Economy and Society in Deauville, France. I have been invited to lecture in dozens of universities in Europe, United States, including Harvard. My university, the Catholic University of Salta, has recently created the Constanza Ceruti Honorary Chair on Sacred Mountains. The importance of mountain studies, glacial and high-altitude archaeology has been clearly demonstrated before each of these prestigious institutions, and the message has been spread wherever I have lectured for the last quarter of a century. Thank you very much.
What an incredible presentation from Constanza. She is a true pioneer, and her presentation, I believe, truly shows that archaeology and women in archaeology can be found everywhere. Unfortunately, she will not be able to join us tonight for the Q&A, but perhaps at another time or at an event in the future. So we've gone from Egypt to Rome, Turkey, and now we go from South American peaks to Polynesia. Can you guess why this program is called Far Afield? Our next speaker works on a site that I would suspect most of you watching this program have heard of. Dr. Joanne Van Tilburg is the founding director of the Easter Island Statue Project. Her island-wide survey studies the more than 1,000 monolithic statues for which Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is famous worldwide. She's recently completed the major excavations of 4 statues in Rano Raraku, please excuse me if I pronounce that wrong, quarry. Additionally, she is an enthusiastic advocate for site preservation in the context of global climate change, and her research interests address the symbolism and social structure, as well as the complex ways that humans employ cultural resources and ancient aesthetics to relate to, alter, and shape and impact their natural landscape. So, Joanne, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? I hope so. Today, I'd like to talk to you about something that is of great interest to me, and I hope to you as well, and that is the sense of our involvement on Easter Island with not only an archaeological site and a site that holds fascination for most of us, but also a place that has home to a living culture. And I think in that way, perhaps one of the things that I've done is somewhat different than what we've been talking about thus far. And that is that essentially, I'm working in concert with Rapa Nui people from many walks of life on Easter Island and of many different age groups and backgrounds and interests. And that has caused me to become involved in their lives, in their history, and in the faces of the island that are not just stone faces anymore, but the real living features of people whose ancestors produced a culture that to this day interests you and me. And I think that that is a very dynamic anthropological situation within which to work. So basically, if I look back, as I will now, I hope, to the face of history, I'd like to give you just a short thumbnail sketch of one woman's professional odyssey on this island. And it's a Polynesian island, as you know, as was just explained to you, in the middle of the Southeastern Pacific. But it's not alone in Polynesia. The people of Rapa Nui are directly, historically, linguistically, culturally, and in every way possible related to the rest of Eastern Polynesia and what we call in Pacific studies, the Polynesian Triangle. So these folks are among the world's greatest voyagers. In fact, the great scholar, Sir Peter Buck, called them Vikings of the Sunrise. In fact, indeed, when NASA was first sending on this great day that we're marking today with a new sense of exploration of the space, NASA was sending groups of people into space very, very early. They met with the descendants of Polynesian explorers to talk with them about the cultural and scientific background of the exploration of the Pacific. It was a very, very dynamic interchange, and I think it brought to the fore the idea that people who sailed 1,000 years ago into the remote Pacific with no sense really of home, but a great need and desire and drive of exploration. So the entire Pacific Ocean and the people in it within this Polynesian Triangle are directly related to one another and directly related to the sea as their environment. You and I look at the sea and we see it as a barrier to communication. We see it as a challenge to cross. They looked at it and they regarded it in their way as the open ceremonial space upon which they interacted with their gods and with nature, with the sky, with the clouds, with the birds, with the fish, with the tides, with the constant coming and going of the wave action. So they were not alone in this exploration. In their canoe, they carried with them the sense of their ancestor spirits. And in fact, to this day, in many Polynesian islands, a seat is reserved in a canoe for the ancestral spirit. So we're really looking at people who bounded across the remote Pacific with a sense of exploration, but not with a feeling of loneliness. And I think that that's something that it's hard sometimes for us to understand or to come fully to grips with. When did all of this happen? We don't know for sure, but I'm here to tell you from my experience as an archaeologist 3 decades long on Rapa Nui, that I am one of the people that believe that the settlement of Easter Island was earlier than is commonly thought. And that date, which is accepted by most people, would be, most researchers certainly, would be around 900 AD. It is possible that it was 100 or 200 years even earlier than that. And that is in part because the extent and the magnitude of the archaeological remains on Easter Island really tell a story of a very involved people with not a lot of resources, but who made the best use of what was available to them over a relatively short period of time in the overall picture, but a relatively long picture of strength of time within the immediate environment of the few islands that are related to them geographically. My ideas come from not only the work we have done, but the shoulders upon which we stand of those who have preceded us. And in fact, the excavations that we have conducted have calculated and helped us to standardize the likelihood of a chain of events that led to the construction of certain numbers of statues within a certain portion of the quarry where they were carved. And I think our work has contributed significantly to a detailed settlement history for the island, which we are currently working on, but it also has produced some results for us that are very transparent can be reproduced or tested with the information we have secured and documented. And I think that for the first time in the history of the island, there is a very large, very deep excavation or series of excavations that are documented well with modern technology. When we look back to the early days of archaeology on Easter Island, and those days are exemplified by Tor Heyerdahl, a member of the Explorers Club and a great adventurer of Kon-Tiki fame. In those days, the modern archaeological methods that were applied were good for that era, but have been found lacking as time passes. So we've had a lot of catching up to do on Rapa Nui in terms of modernizing our way of looking at the past. But also, I think I'm taking a great deal of pride here and tooting my own horn in that we have been in our project anyway, been very, very responsible for bringing together large groups of people on the island to get behind our projects, but also collaborations with our colleagues worldwide. So we have 18 archaeologists with whom we collaborate on a very, very personal and professional basis. And these archaeologists have generously provided us with data they personally have collected in their segment of the island-wide archaeological survey. Hence, we have not only the excavation evidence that I'm going to summarize here for you today, but also we have a significant amount of contextual information that tells us a lot about population, population numbers, about the agricultural practices that were undertaken at that time, but also as well, a very, very strong collection of artifactual documentation that comes from museum work conducted by colleagues with whom we are involved. The purpose of this collaboration is not only to expand and extend our own research, but it is basically to allow us to publish someday soon, we hope, within the year, an atlas of Easter Island, which will be based on, again, the collaborative interchange of data from 18 very, very experienced archaeologists internationally. So we're hoping that we'll be able to extend our knowledge of Rapa Nui, but also bring to the fore the history of archaeological work and Pacific studies on Easter Island. One of the most important things we've looked at, and one of the things that has come from our work, is the documentation of the sweet potato. The sweet potatoes, you might ask, why are they important? They're important because Tor Heyerdahl and others before him back to the 1880s hypothesized that this plant, which is a native to the South American area, was carried into the Pacific by adventurers, or either purposefully or blown off course accidentally, individuals prehistorically of native descent who were not Polynesian. And this type of situation, this business with the sweet potato, raised hackles on a lot of Polynesian archaeologists, caused some disagreements, as you might expect, but also motivated archaeologists to really look at where in the Pacific this kind of information exists, where we found these plants, where we found evidence of them, and so on. But we now know on Easter Island unequivocally through our excavations that the sweet potato was on Easter Island 100 to 200 years prior to European discovery of the island in 1722. And this, in the context of Polynesian voyaging, strongly suggests that it was Polynesian people who carried this, this plant, or the tubers of it, cuttings from it, to Easter Island and transplanted it as part of what we call in Polynesian studies, the transported landscape. So we have here the first really good, dated, contextualized, identified sweet potato on Rapa Nui, certainly, but in parts of Polynesia as well. We also have a substantial amount of chronological material, chronological results from our excavation. And basically, we can say with a fair amount of optimism in terms of the modeling that we've done through a statistical process most of you are familiar with called Bayesian analyses. But we think that of the 2 standing statues we have excavated, one of them was likely erected, quite specifically, between 1455 and 1605. And we also think that quarrying in the area where we are working probably ceased sometime around 1665 to 1750. These are both dates are with 95% reliability projected. So basically what that means is that, and when we get to the statues, I'll explain quite clearly, I hope, why these statues are very important out of all of the 1,000 we have documented. What we see here is that 7-meter tall statues were being carved and erected and held in place in the quarry where they were created up to and probably overlapping with the coming of Europeans in 1722. That doesn't mean that these objects were being carried from the quarry or transported from the quarry and erected elsewhere. But it does mean that carving had probably continued on Rapa Nui well into just prior to the coming of Europeans. Basically, the message I would like to deliver today is that the stone faces of Rapa Nui are indeed world-renowned and highly significant to all of us. But behind those faces are Rapa Nui people, their children, their elders, and their ancestors. And behind all of that is a sense that the Rapa Nui people have and understand well, which is the importance of the human body, decorated, the importance of performance art, and the importance of sculpture and the depiction of the human body in art, in ritualized art. And this is a notion, I think, that probably in the past, in the writings about Rapa Nui, has escaped a lot of investigators. And that is that the sense of performance art, the sense of public art, the need to have it in the world, the need to have it on a scale and in a number and in sizes that help you to understand who you are and remind you of where you came from, is probably a function to a certain degree, at least in my opinion, of the isolation of the Rapa Nui people in the remote Eastern Pacific. And these tools, if you will, to memory, these mnemonic devices that the statues represent, really put a face on history for Rapa Nui people. And I think it has actually served them quite well in terms of the retention of very, very important aspects of their culture. So the Rapa Nui people, in their understanding of public art, it's important, I think, today, when we look at our own country and we see ourselves destroying public art because we don't like it, we don't agree with it, rightly or not. And I think that it is, in the context of current history, a reminder of how ephemeral some practices, some beliefs, some ways of living in the world can be if we don't have historic reminders of the past. And as so many of these talented women here today have said, it is the past that teaches us about the future. It is the past that helps us to live the present. And without the tools of knowing what the past was and how we fit into it, I think we're at a loss in some ways. The Rapa Nui people understood that in order to have public art, especially on the scale that they did, they had to have leadership, they had to have cooperation, and they had to promise that through the leaders and the cooperative social groups, there would be social continuity. And social continuity naturally included economic prosperity. So public art has a worldwide, no matter where it occurs, including in our own culture, has the capacity to remind us of group accomplishments. It shares public space. It shares space that we interact with and with them. It helps us to understand and establish our identity. It signifies who's in charge and the status of the people who are in charge. And it helps us to replicate whatever the key message of the past is. And on Rapa Nui, that has always been, of course, the question. What do the statues represent? What are they trying to say? What is the message they're delivering? And that, of course, is embedded deeply, not only in archaeology, but in oral traditions and in the history of art and aesthetics on this isolated island. So the impact of public art, and this will come to the fore in a moment as we continue this discussion, is that it creates resources. It causes people to work, but it also consumes or destroys resources. And it sometimes forces responsive actions. Public art in our country has forced responsive actions on the part of some people. Whether those actions are ones you agree with or not, the fact is they're vital, they're real, they're taking place every day in the public square, in the public space, and in the public imagination. And that is human nature when it comes to public art. So here's my site. This is Rano Raraku Quarry. This is what it looks like when you look at it from a drone, as we have. It has a lake in the midst of it. It has an extraordinarily wonderful stone for sculpture. It's made of a consolidated lapilli tuff. Unfortunately, that stone weathers, but it's relatively easy to carve and relatively light. So this place is the place in which we've been working for the last 5 years. Prior to the actual excavation, we conducted a mapping foray that was a modern digital map, which we have produced, of the interior region. It's an illustrated map. And on the exterior region of the quarry, the work was done previously by the team from the University of Chile, led by people with whom the Explorers Club is well familiar, Claudio Cristino and Patricia Vargas. And our map meshes with theirs. So now between all of us, we have contributed to the creation of really a superb map of this area. Our illustrated map, which you see here, has shown us that there are 17 discrete quarries in the interior of Rano Raraku, and that these quarries are probably associated with lineage groups and possibly with families, individual families whose descendants live on Easter Island today. So this process makes it very interesting to contemporary Rapa Nui people, which is, gosh, where do you think my ancestors carved in this quarry? When we look at the slope after we've mapped it, we decided on the excavation of selected statues in order to give us a sense of how and in what order statue carving was conducted. This is not basically new information, but it is the first time this information has been properly documented. So we know how the carvers worked. They started with the heads and the faces, and then the bodies, and then they laid on the details, the decorative details of hands and so on. But once you excavate some of these very large statues that are still incomplete and are covered by soils which have washed down from above, you can see how substantial they are. The statues that we've excavated are much larger, much taller than the ones that are on the slopes. This work that we've conducted has given us enough information, and so that we can do things like build parametric models, which can help us to test whether our metrics are good, bad, or indifferent. Pretty soon we're going to be able to do a lot more with those models, by the way. And as we look at the team that's actually worked in the quarry, we see that the largest number of my participants are women, and they start at the age of 15. So we've got students, local students, and lots of people who have expertise in lots of different ways. On the left is Alice Hom, who's the cartographer for this project. She's a University of California graduate. Rano Ravaku in the interior, this is the lake, and you can see where our site is located. Every one of those blue dots is a place where we have taken points to document the statues and whether they're carved or not carved, and all of the other features that we find in the interior. And here you see one of the two statues we excavated. This is the statue that gave us the most information, number 156. Its profile is on the left. This is the crew. The lady in the upper corner in red is a respected Rapa Nui elder who's now in her 80s, much later than that perhaps, who in 1960 was among the first dance troupe to leave Easter Island with permission, because prior to that, Rapa Nui people were not allowed by the colonial overseers and the Chilean government to depart Rapa Nui under any circumstances, unless they were to go to the mainland with a pass for health reasons or whatever. So she was the first in a group of dancing girls, basically, to tour Europe, and has fond memories and a ton of information about the music and dance of early Rapa Nui people. Here is the other part of my life, and that is two-dimensional art, rock art. As the director of the Easter Island Project, I've been looking, of course, at three-dimensional sculpture. As the director of the Rock Art Archive at UCLA, my influence there has been, and my expertise, I think, has developed over the years in terms of rock art and its application to sculpture. So here you look at a very interesting situation whereby we have an iconic presentic element that represents a canoe, obviously a quintessential Polynesian symbol, that has been applied to the backs of both statues that we've excavated. There are only 3 statues out of over 1,000 where the backs of the statues are covered in these kinds of symbols. The 3rd statue is in the British Museum. It is called Hoa Hakanana Ia. It was collected in 1868 by HMS Topaz. It does not have these symbols on it. It has much more evolved symbols and elements that incorporate this vaka or canoe symbol. And those carvings are in bas relief, whereas the carvings on these 2 statues are incised, pecked, and abraded. The interesting thing is that the artifact that you see on the side of the screen was found buried. First of all, it has carved on it a Polynesian canoe with a steering paddle, and it was found tucked under the base of this statue. This again is 156. The plan that you see on this half of the screen shows the 2 statues, 157 and 156, standing next to each other in a single quarry. They're both permanently implanted in the quarry. They were never intended to be moved. So consequently, 156 is actually embedded in the ground, and it has a pavement around and under it, and it has a wall carved out of bedrock to protect it. And then behind it, 157 is sitting on a pedestal. So both of these statues were then inundated with soils that came down from above, that were washed down from above based on, basically based on erosion. Excuse me. So they're permanently there, they're not going anywhere. Question is why? They have a 3rd or companion figure, and it is this head. It's a small, 72 centimeters tall, anthropomorphic figure, poorly carved, just basically roughed out, but tucked against the side of 156 between it and the wall on its own pedestal. There's an interesting story that's related to these 2 statues. In addition to the historic information we have collected, we know that from 1914 onward, there was a story that this particular quarry was worked by one family on Rapa Nui, and that the 2 statues were called Papa and Mama, and this perhaps was a baby. We don't know anything, we don't know if that's true or not, but ethnohistory in Polynesia can be considered accurate for approximately 100 years. The stories change over time because all of our memories change over time. But in general, the Rapa Nui people appear to have known or have seen, maybe 2 generations or 3 generations earlier, these 2 statues either in their fully uncovered state or partially uncovered state. We don't know for sure. So what these 2 statues have revealed to us is a time frame, chronology, an iconography, ethnohistorical data, and some very, very intimate information about the lives, really, of 1 or 2 families on Rapa Nui today and in the past. So I think if I can give you any summation here of the kind of work that we do, I'm very interested not only in the past. I want to understand what the past can tell us about the present, just as all the other women here have described in practically the same words. We really are on a quest of self-discovery and a quest of understanding human relationships. The relationships in Rapa Nui today and in the past are intimate, they're lasting, they're sometimes confused, they're frequently angry, they're sometimes conflicted, they're concerned, they're very, very concerned about the coming threat to their island from rising sea levels and site damage, which is very real and very unpleasant to see when you actually see sites collapsing from this kind of thing, too much rain, etc. But they also look to the future in a very optimistic way, hoping that what they learned from the past will be applicable to their children's future. And when we come to a culture like this, small, isolated, but driven by a need to put a face and a name on human experience, I think we stand in awe of this accomplishment. Thank you very much.
Extraordinary. Joanne, thank you so much for that presentation. So much work and thought and effort went into that, and your speech was beautiful, and your presentation entirely. I really loved the connection that you make from archaeology flowing up to anthropology and humanity as a whole in the present, whereas I think that so often we see it flowing the other way, from humans, the things we make and then leave behind. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary work. Thank you.
Thank you.
So can you, our viewers tonight, can you see why I said in the presence of greatness? I mean, these presentations, the hard work, the intellect, the study, the fascinating results, these women have truly changed the face of archaeology and history as we know it. So thank you so much, Salima, Sarah, Constanza, and Joanne. Thank you so much for being a part of this tonight. Now, we're going to change the look of our format here so you can see all of us. And we're going to open it up for some questions from you tonight, our viewers. So to get things kicked off, I did find a very interesting question from Markham Karis, please excuse me if I pronounce that incorrectly, who mentions so much migration is motivated by need for food, land, trade. And how can we really know if past peoples were motivated primarily by an urge to discover or simply practicality? And I think given that it's the Explorers Club and discovery, it's a very interesting topic to ask anyone and everyone here in this panel, how much do we believe that these ancient cultures were interested in exploration or discovery, or was it primarily need-based and driven?
Well, may I?
Please.
Yes. What I will say is that we know that Polynesians were, as Peter Buck said, the Vikings of the sunrise, great explorers. However, we also know from looking at the ecological changes that we can see that were human-induced on certain islands, that there was a need always to keep pushing to find a new island. Not in every case. In Tikopia, for example, that it wasn't necessarily true, but in Mangareva, for example, which is the nearest neighbor to Easter Island, we know that deforestation there, damage to soils fertility, the destruction of endemic species of birds in particular, other kinds of ecological evidence says very clearly that the human impact on this island was so profound that, you know, people would move on. And we can see that. Part of the reason right now people move, obviously, is for those ecological reasons. I don't think that that was different in the past. But that doesn't negate, it works hand in hand, doesn't it, with the spirit of exploration.
Interestingly, in ancient Egypt, certainly a lot of what we do have is exploration looking for raw materials. So it is true also sometimes when you run out of something, we have in the sites that I've worked in the Western Desert, we have expeditions going out to basically see what is there, where it leads to, and if it leads to any place where they can get raw materials that they now either don't have in the Nile Valley or have completely mined and quarried out. So it's interesting to watch this stretch outwards, which is a combination of exploration for curiosity, but also generated by an economic need.
I would say that that is the case also with the Roman Empire. For the most part, their expansion was driven in a desire to acquire more economic resources, resources that they could exploit, particularly in the case of Egypt, in fact, because
greedy people.
Yes, people. Indeed. But Romans were also culturally, they had this concept of what we call manifest destiny. You know, they believed in their inherent superiority and that it was their and I think, you know, the applicability to colonialism in general is a completely different discussion, but it's not exclusive to the Romans, that it was their duty, their right to expand and acquire these territories, even though there were already very vibrant cultures already established and living there.
Fascinating. And yeah, I think that we see those themes throughout history. You know, they say, I read a quote the other day that said that history doesn't repeat itself, but humans always do. So I think perhaps there's a little bit of that in there as well.
The old conceits, as Elvis Costello said.
Indeed. So we actually, during the program, we had a number of different questions come through for each of you. So I might feed a few of those through, starting with you, Salima. From Aubrey Whitaker asks, what was it that drew you to funerary archaeology and specifically Egyptian mummies?
Well, the funerary bit was quite accidental, as I said, because I was really interested in daily life. And then from there, because I was working on meat preservation, there were the mummies. And I actually had been interested in mummies. What child is not, if you're normal? And then I found that, in fact, there was no one book that was written about mummies, mummification, the history of mummies, mummy studies, the use of mummies broken up and ground up and eaten or used for paint, coffins, amulets, wrappings, etc. And so I thought, well, this is a real pain, because I was trying to teach a class on it. So I thought, let's just write a book on it, because then at least it'll all be in one place and I won't be aggravated. And so while I was working on the book, obviously, like Topsy, it just grew. And that's how I got slightly derailed from my daily life into doing a lot of funerary archaeology. But luckily in ancient Egypt, when you do funerary archaeology, you find a lot of the accoutrements of daily life as well. So I am happily able to do both. And of course, by looking at bodies and doing some physical anthropology, you learn a lot more about daily life in terms of what people ate, what diseases they had, and very intimate personal histories, what bones they broke and whether their surgeon was any good, nice or not nice. So that's how one grew into this.
Wonderful. The next question that I will throw is at Sarah. Throw a question at you, not necessarily. My brain might be starting. My brain may be starting to shut down. It is 3:38 in the morning, but we are going to do this Q&A for another about 15 minutes, sort of 10-15 minutes, after which we'll wrap it up. So please, anyone who does still have questions, send them through in the chat box, because we will take them for about the next 10 to 15 minutes. So Sarah, Rip Russell asks and says, it's surprising to him that dissection was illegal in the imperial period, even for medical education. And he's curious as to why that was. And I mean, given the Romans have the Colosseum, they certainly aren't exactly afraid of blood. I think it's a very valid question and very interesting.
And sorry to interrupt, because that was one of my questions to Sarah as well. So also, was it okay at some point, and did it stop being okay at another point? So what is the sort of diachronic story about this?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Excellent question, because it's one that I have. In the course of all of my research and the colleagues with whom I work on this, we have combed through the textual sources exhaustively. Not one author can point to a reason why this is illegal. It is only noted that it is prohibited and that it requires special dispensation from the imperial administration to conduct a human dissection. So what I can only answer you with theories. I can only speculate, based on conversations with my colleagues and our own observations. And to Salima, your point, yes, it was permitted, for example, in Alexandria, even when it was under Roman control, under Roman rule. It was permitted in Egypt.
Yep.
It was also permitted in certain areas of Greece. And one colleague of mine has this theory that it is perhaps because even though Romans were incredibly dependent on Egypt in particular, but also for their economic stability, but also very dependent on Greece for so much of their culture, even their language and their religion. So much of it was borrowed from Greek culture. And yet they had this love-hate relationship with both of those cultures. Especially if you read the Roman authors, they are very disparaging of the Greeks, and especially in the early period of in the Roman Republic, a lot of these authors, Cato in particular, is very polemical against Greek doctors, not because they're doctors, but because they're Greek. So one of the theories is that because this is something that was engaged in routinely for educational purposes by these other cultures, the Romans saw it as something that was undesirable. There's no particular religious reason why it should have been prohibited. But it's an excellent question because it's one that has a lot of us scratching our heads as well. And there's a lot of theories. People will have a lot of different ideas, but I can tell you, we see nothing in the textual sources that gives us a very clear answer from the Roman perspective of why this was forbidden. The imperial authorities did acknowledge that this was necessary for medical training, and Hippocrates, even, who was Greek, not Roman, he recommends that aspiring doctors join the military to gain anatomical training. It was not illegal in Greece, but clearly the availability or the access to anatomical demonstrations was not what Hippocrates thought it should be. He thought that doctors could learn anatomy on the job if you will.
Do you think, Sarah, it might be that in Rome at least they thought, oh, we don't want good Roman citizens cut up, and that therefore only with permission you can, whereas in all these foreign parts, doesn't really matter what happens to those people. So Sahlan, go ahead and do what you want. I mean, I'm sure you, but it's an interesting idea that it was okay for part of the Roman Empire, but not for Rome proper. And I wonder if it's just that
part of the,
maybe the odd slave could be looked at, but not
yeah, and Romans were very discriminating in terms of who was a citizen and who was not, and yet even in the Italic Peninsula, there were plenty of people who did not have citizenship status.
Absolutely.
So that is still a question mark for us. Certainly, had they allowed that, there's probably a number of Roman soldiers who would have appreciated not being practiced upon.
Absolutely. Yeah, the concept of us and them, I think, is something that is so intrinsic to humans. And it's something that with every way in which I see it, because it permeates basically every aspect of anthropology, archaeology, any science involving humans. And it's something that I puzzle on a great deal as to why it is that we do that in general, in that distinction and separation and segmentation of us versus them. So incidentally, club fellow Professor Alex Moore notes that there's a great book on ancient dissection by Catherine Park called Secrets of Women. Yeah. Has anyone here, have you heard of that, Sarah?
I've heard of it, yes. No, I haven't read it, no. Okay. No, with the project I've been involved in, I've had little time for anything beyond site-specific work this year, but I have heard of it. So it certainly would be worth checking out.
So I will send a next question to you, Joanne, from Luna Hisayo. Please, again, apologies if I pronounced that one wrong. So a question for Dr. Tilburg: how can Indigenous people at Rapa Nui enjoy economic prosperity in this modern era, whilst also preserving their way of life, their traditional skills and culture? And I think that this is a very applicable question worldwide. So I'm also very curious to hear your answer.
It's very interesting to think about, because we are concerned always in our culture, which is multicultural, or at least we like to think it is, of appropriation of other people's cultures. The Rapa Nui people are very concerned with not that particularly. They're concerned with the overwhelming influence of our numbers and of our love for the island. And that means that when I went to Easter Island in 1981, there were 2,500 people per year who visited. Today, there are 100,050 per year who visit. Now, I know by Egyptian standards, or perhaps European Roman standards, that's not many people. But by the standard of us, and in the actual context of what the island has to offer physically in terms of electricity, water, transport, food, etc., that's a very, very large number of people. But it also causes Rapa Nui people to become seduced in lots of ways by another way of life. And that troubles them. They've done some very interesting things. For example, their language is not spoken anywhere else in the world. It is related to Hawaiian and to the Maori of New Zealand and to all other languages of Eastern Polynesia. And there is a cross-cultural ability and cross-linguistic ability to understand and communicate in the Polynesian community. So they've done a couple of things. The first thing they did was create their own sense of the institution, if you will, of language on Rapa Nui. They explored within the community. They talked for a long, long time, years in fact, about how to organize and how to teach the language and whose version of the language was the acceptable one. They came to understand what compromise means in terms of meanings. That was a very, very important step. They also had behind them a history of colonialism on the mainland, wherein they were not allowed to speak their language while the youngsters were in school and so on. So they come from a position in the world of having learned from firsthand experience what it means to be treated as the other. And they do not wish to treat those who visit as the other. On the other hand, they don't want to become the other. So it's a very, very complex and interesting way to live in the world. And I think the analysis has always been, and the connection has been made between small isolated islands and the planet. If what happens there, what does it teach us about what happens on our planet? The truth of the matter is that Rapa Nui people do not want to live as our metaphor for the way we live. They wish to become seen and to be seen and to be respected and held as a knowledgeable group of people who have struggled and continue to struggle, but have some things to teach and a lot to learn. So it's a very modest and honest approach. It comes out of, as I said, colonialism, but there is a very, very large well of anger as well to how the world has treated them. So I think the answer to the question is not for me to give. The answer to the question is for us to open our eyes and live in the world and see how others are struggling with situations that are sometimes very dissimilar and in many ways quite the same as what we are living through right now in the Western world and in this country of ours.
I think that's a theme that we're seeing from many different Indigenous communities around the world, and also as people who are now several generations down, several generations further, or even several generations mixed into our more westernized society, who have the desire to reclaim parts of their heritage, relearn their languages, reintegrate, etc. And I think that, at least from what I'm seeing, I now follow a number of different, for example, Indigenous language accounts on Instagram, or these sorts of movements are starting to happen. But I couldn't agree more that it's not for us to say, but it is definitely something that, for me at least, is something that I really want to listen to. It's not for me to say it, but to hear it.
It seems, and I agree with you, it seems to me there are two principles of interest right now to archaeologists and anthropologists. Not that there are many, but of course, but there are two that I would point out that we deal with on a regular basis. And Costanza, in her taped presentation, touched on some of these things. The first is that I think that there is an overall rejection of expertise when it comes to the past. And by the same token and in the same way, there is a need, well, let me rephrase this. There is also in our own profession of archaeology, sometimes the sense that archaeology itself is destructive, that we go in and we excavate and we create a situation that destroys something. And what does that mean? My experience on Easter Island is that the Rapa Nui people were eager and interested and expert at uncovering their own past. They wanted to do that. They saw it as valuable information they wished to have. And so they constituted the crew that did this work, as I said, from across the age and expertise spectrums. But I think that if we as archaeologists and anthropologists wish to interact with living cultures and with the remnants of the past of great state societies, we have to come to grips with sometimes the feelings of contemporary people that would give us pause and cause us to reflect on our own profession and our own way of conducting ourselves as archaeologists and anthropologists.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joanne. Did anyone else have anything to add to that? We're getting a little bit short on time, so I might add another question or maybe two in there. I do wanted to make a quick note that Kathleen H. sent us a really lovely comment. She said that she's been watching while baking in her kitchen. what are you baking, Kathleen? Send us some through the Zoom. And that she wanted to thank each of us for feeding her explorer soul. And that expands beyond her personal experiences. So, I mean, Kathleen, that's why we're here tonight. That's why we are members of this club. And that's why we put on presentations and events exactly like this, is because we do want to involve people that are, it shouldn't be an insular thing. Exploration should be shared. Yeah. And it's best when it is, just like cookies, Kathleen, just like, I hope you're baking cookies. But I mean, exploration should be shared, and science should be shared, and knowledge and wonder and curiosity. I think these are also really core tenets of what it is to be a human being. And the more that we let those out and into the world and into our relationships and our communities, I think it can only be for the better. Mm-hmm. So I will, oh gosh, I'm actually, we have a whole bunch more. You know what? I think we can do another 2 questions. And then I have one final question that I want to ask to all 3 of you before our quick wrap up. So I'm going to put through a question from Matilda Grand, who incidentally is also with the Darklands Foundation and who works with the Nabebule communities in Boca del Toro in Panama, and who I worked with to make our short film. But she sent through a question about, actually for you, Sarah, about medicinal plants and traces of them in the Medica Taberna. But I think that's actually also an interesting question that each of you 3 might touch on as indigenous medicine plants that have been found or were integrated in these sites that you've been working on. So potentially each of you might like to answer it as well.
She just wanted a bit more information about that, or what types
of?
Yeah. Okay, so Pliny the Elder catalogs over 900 medicinal substances that he was able to document that were used in medicine in his time. Some of those were not only not therapeutic, they were actually downright harmful, but he was just the documenter. He was not a physician himself. But we have pinpointed several medicines that the ancient Romans used that would have been quite effective for the conditions that they were treating. For example, they had a substance called castioreum, which contains hydrocinamic acid. Hydrocinamic acid is almost molecularly identical to phenol, which was a pioneering antiseptic of the 19th century. It also contains salicylic acid, which many of you may know as aspirin. So here you have this very useful substance, not just to combat infection, but also pain. And castioreum is a substance that is secreted by a beaver. So of all the interesting, I've always wondered, who's the guy that figured that out?
Exactly what I was thinking. How did...
Yeah. So frankincense and myrrh, for example, if you know the Christian nativity story, frankincense and myrrh are part of the gifts that the wise men bring. They were precious in antiquity, not because they were used as incense, they were used as medicines. And modern science tells us that these tree resins are bacteriostatics. They prevent bacteria from replicating. So those too could be used to prevent infection. Ephedra, which comes from a plant, is used to make something called ephedrine. This is what we use today for allergic cough, asthma, hemorrhaging. It was used in antiquity the same way. So they had, and I could go on and on. There's a whole lecture I do just on that. So they did have substances that were effective or reasonably effective for certain conditions, and they all derived from the natural world. And many of our modern medications, are either directly using these plants and minerals and other substances, or they are synthesizing them synthetically and using them in modern medication. 'Cause, 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 'cause,
Well, I can tell you a story about Rapa Nui medicines, and that is that in 1960, a medical expedition from Canada was sent to Rapa Nui for many different reasons, but one of them was blood sampling and DNA studies and so on. And during the time they were there, one of their members wandered off to different areas and decided he would sample the soils of Rapa Nui. And he took selected samples from very carefully recorded areas. He went back with the group when it returned to Canada, and there he grew in culture a bacterium that he recognized had some potential. Cut to the chase. The potential is that from this soil sample, or series of samples, that he and the expedition, it's called the Métis expedition, made freely available in Canada and the United States. From this sample, in culture, individual researchers in South America and the United States, Canada, and elsewhere developed a drug. The name for it, the common name for it today, that's advertised under this name, is rapamycin. It has two functions. The first is that it successfully prevents the rejection of kidney implants. And the second is, this is hot news, is that it seems to have longevity possibilities. In other words, it's a kind of drug that can reduce or slow certain aging processes in the brain and body. So this is a unique sort of accidental brilliance of the soil of Rapa Nui. And today, from my understanding, there's at least one member of the Explorers Club whose life in many ways was saved by the use of this drug. So that's pretty exciting.
Extraordinary.
Very cool.
Isn't it? I will say also in our excavations, we have found plants and evidence of trees through the micro and macro fossil analyses that were used on Rapa Nui for lots of reasons. One of them was, of course, the Polynesian transfer that produced, the inner bark of which produced fabric that the Rapa Nui people, through a process that's very well known, created bark cloth that was very important to the high status individuals on the island. So we have about 12 or 14 plants and identified that were of economic and medicinal uses in the quarry.
Interestingly, to catch on with what Sarah has to say, though, frankincense and myrrh, standard to be used in high quality mummification, again, as antibacteria. And also alum to stop the bleeding. Mm-hmm. So it's quite interesting because we have all of these texts, medical texts, plus we have the bodies. And also we have a tradition that continued on from pharaonic medicine into sort of Greek and Roman, but in Egypt, into Coptic traditions and into Islamic traditions, some bringing things from Syria and other places, but also very much in Egypt. And some of us are trying to work out what plants and ways of dealing with different diseases are still being used today, passed on more sort of in a more sort of traditional manner, not just through texts, but through how people are taking these plants, mushing them up and applying them. So it's quite interesting to see these. And also in ancient Egypt, we have images in tombs that showed the manifestation of different diseases like bilharzia or this or that. And ways in which people are trying to cure it are also put down. So it's very interesting to see these traditions that continue from 3000 BC into the present day in a more folkloric way, with some of these elements now being increasingly explored, as Joanne was saying, by larger pharmaceutical companies, because this is happening all over the world, where pharmaceutical companies are in fact going to indigenous medicine and trying to learn from that and then make it in a, in a lab, rather than using, thank God, using up all of the natural resources. But it is a good dialogue.
That would be a fascinating collaborative study, wouldn't it? To get a group of us together. And because I know, Rome, Joanne mentioned, and I thought this was a very apt reference, the shoulders upon which we stand as scholars, when we're talking about medicine in the Roman period, so much of it was borrowed from the Greeks. The Greeks themselves took a lot of it from Egypt.
Absolutely.
And so many, we have in the frontiers, the Roman hospitals, the legionary hospitals, as far north as Britain. We have shipping manifests, actually, which indicate medicinal substances imported from Egypt, from the area that is now Syria and even Yemen. So, it all builds. Nothing develops in a vacuum. Everything is sort of borrowing from that which came before.
Exactly. Well, that is definitely a study that I think everyone here is into for a collaboration. Perhaps not tonight, over a slightly longer period of time. Maybe not thousands and thousands of years, but a slightly longer period of time. But I think that everything also that we've talked about, especially in this question, just goes to show for me how much truly left there is to explore. New disciplines are opening up all of the time, whether it be in the transition of ancient medicine into modern pharmaceuticals, or the use of medical tools in antiquity through to modernity, through to modern tools and how they've changed. So I think that there is a huge scope for exploration. This is something that I hear from a lot of people, in that, oh, we've seen it all. We have to go to space now. No offense to the people who go to space. That's also awesome. But I think that there is still so much left to explore here in our natural world and in this incredible Earth ecosystem, human systems, that we still have yet to understand, and that we can always understand, like Sarah's lasagna, deeper and deeper into its layers. Speaking of lasagnas, we could actually go on with questions for a lot of lasagna. But I do want to wrap up with one final question to each of you before we say goodnight, and thanks to everyone. We have a lot of people watching tonight who perhaps they had wanted to be archaeologists at one time, perhaps they're considering a career in it. And also, I think that part of what these presentations also aim to do is to inspire the next generation of people who are going far afield, whose dreams are to go far afield. And so I would love to know if each of you would please offer a piece of advice to someone maybe considering a career in archaeology, starting out in a career in archaeology, considering changing into a career in archaeology, or in general interested in exploration. So maybe Salima, would you like to go first?
Well, I think you do it as long as you love it. And certainly I want to say, particularly to any of the women, don't let anyone say no. Just don't let that word happen. And I think there's so much to be learned, whether it is actually out in the field or combining that with library research. There is, as you said before, a huge planet and untold mysteries beneath the different lasagna layers in each and every country. And I think that there is so much more to be learned, that one should come up with a lot of questions and then figure out the best way of pursuing them to get an answer. Because I think you need to have the curiosity and the passion if you're going to succeed.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much. Joanne or Sarah, next.
Well, I think, I totally agree with what was just said. I would also like to say to young women, give yourself time. When you throw yourself into something, it takes some time for you to identify what passion feels like to you. And it can take many forms. It can provide many kinds of inspirations and motivations, but it might take time and maturity for you to really understand how it feels to be passionate about some intellectual field pursuit. I don't think that's an easy discovery to make. I think we talk about discovery and how important it is, and adventure and field work, but archaeology is also long hours alone in front of a computer. It's also many times going home at night and crying because, you know, you didn't quite get it right, or you wish that you had made that turn of the spade instead of that turn of the spade. So I think give yourself time, forgive yourself your mistakes, and don't take anything from anybody.
That's brilliant advice. And thank you very much for that. I think that we are encouraged often to rush into things. And look, there are sometimes those people who knew he wanted to be a brain surgeon since he was 5. I know someone like that. I was not like that. I know a lot of people who were not like that. In fact, I am studying now at the ripe old age of 34 because I didn't know. And it's exactly as you say, Joanne, once you understand what passion feels like to you and what drive feels like to you and the ways in which you're motivated that last and have longevity and that don't, I think that that's also something to really cultivate that awareness of yourself prior perhaps to committing to something.
I agree.
So thank you very much for that comment. That's brilliant. Sarah?
So to echo what Salima and Joanna said, the word passion has come up multiple times, and that's critical to any career path, I think, if you're going to find satisfaction and fulfillment in it, no matter what it is. But one thing I would say to aspiring archaeologists is don't be limited by the traditional path. Because I think, when I declared to my parents that this is what I wanted to study, I had my aha moment in college, and this is what I'm going to do. And their first question was, well, what are you going to do with that? And then for many years after, what are you going to do with that? As I was pursuing various courses, I have done a lot, and it's been exciting and it's been fun. And it has not necessarily, I did not check all the boxes in the exact order. I did not go to college and then straight to get my PhD and then do a postdoc and then get, assistant professor. Be open to non-traditional paths unless you are really anxious to get tenure in a university, which is certainly not a bad thing. I love teaching. There are other opportunities open to people who make a career of pursuing the past. I think now more than ever, learning from history is critical, and even just as important, if not more so, are people who, like Danae, doing what they're doing. It's not enough just to study the past and be an expert on certain parts of the past. You have to be able to communicate it. You have to be able to tell the story in a way that matters to people, that gets people engaged. Now, why do we care what happened 2,000 years ago? Well, because, history can teach us a lot about how to go forward into our future. And so think about what you're good at, think about what you love, and be open to career options that are outside of the traditional path.
I think that's also brilliant advice, Sarah. And I would add my own piece of advice. I'm perhaps not at the place yet in my career, at least in an archaeological, in a scientific, academic sense yet, where you are at some point we'll be able to have 4 doctors in one of these panels, but I'm a little ways off from that yet. But I would say that one of my one of the things that I have learned in life so far, and that has become apparent as one of the most important things that I think I didn't realize earlier on, is that no matter what you think you are passionate about, whatever has a spark for you or that you think you might be interested in, the first step is to reach out to those who are already living it, to build a community of people around it, to find others, to ask advice, to have talks with, to do exactly what we're doing here tonight with, and learn about the realities. And through that, you create a community around something that you all share. And I think that community is something that is so truly essential to the human experience, no matter whether it be in study, in everyday life, in having drinks around the table at the Explorers Club, but community and interaction with one another is actually really what it's all about. So when you're interested in something, reach out to people who are already working in that thing.
Absolutely.
So really interesting comment, incredible comment has just been dropped into the chat by our member and I think a dear friend of all of us, David Dolan, who says that he is in fact the member that you referred to, Joanne. Rapamune was used to prevent organ rejection for his transplanted lungs, and he has had his life saved thanks to Rapa Nui.
Yeah.
So
That's
extraordinary.
special.
The past.
I just got goosebumps.
Me too.
That's amazing.
The past making the future literally possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think that, however, we are going to wrap up there. I do want to thank everyone who attended and who tuned into this event. All of you out there, I wish that at some point we can all be sitting in the beautiful heritage building that is our Explorers Club headquarters, and we can all do this in person and clap for each other and then have a drink downstairs near the polar bear. But thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you for your interesting questions and for your engagement tonight. I hope that you'll reach out to us on social media, in the comments, or through another way, through the club, and let us know again what you thought, where you watched from, any sorts of feedback. We always love to engage in those kind of conversations with people who took their time to spend it with us. Yes, so thank you again to the Explorers Club. Thank you to Discovery. Thank you to Milbury, Kevin, and everyone behind the scenes. Thank you to our esteemed panel of these extraordinary women tonight, Salima, Sarah, Constanza. I'll send you a carrier pigeon. Thanks, and maybe a cookie.
Yeah.
Share. Joanne. Everyone, it's been such an honor, not just tonight, but over the past months, to learn about your extraordinary lives, your projects. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your stories with me and with everyone here tonight. I hope that this will be repeated many times over, probably in dirtier, muddier locations or even fancier ones on the Upper East Side. Now, tonight's event for everyone watching may be finished, but please, everyone, mark your calendars for August the 24th, because the amazing Kate Bosler, she's also absolutely gorgeous, extremely intelligent, and very, very fun, we'll be hosting another panel event. It's the next in this series, and it is about incredible women field biology researchers. And then, of course, put a big, giant circle, star, heart, throw a dart in it, whatever suits you, around November 5th and 6th to take part in our Pathfinders Symposium, and again, celebrate women being inducted members into the Explorers Club for the past 40 years and going stronger every year. You won't want to miss the events of Pathfinders. So everyone, please take care, stay safe, and never stop exploring far afield.
Yeah. Thank you.
Danae, thank you for giving up your entire night. It's now morning in Athens.
Get some sleep.
I had nothing else to do. What, I was going to sleep? This was the stuff of dreams. Much better.
Thanks so much.
Everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.